Part 5 of this video series on the Barkers of Wilkes County, North Carolina, and their descendants who migrated to Morgan County, Kentucky, entitled The Barkers and Gevedons in the Civil War Battle of Middle Creek, ended with the defeat of Humphrey Marshall's Confederate Army by James A. Garfield's Union Army just outside Prestonsburg, Kentucky in early January 1862. A lack of food, ammunition, and supplies forced Marshall to withdraw most of his army back to Virginia. It was the second time the 5th Kentucky Infantry with the Barkers and Gevedons were being forced out of their home state. Marshall had taken his Virginians through the Pound Gap and camped them at Gladeville, now Wise, in Wise County, Virginia. But Colonel John S. Williams was ordered to keep his 5th Kentucky Infantry, about 1,000 men, including Jack May and his Company A, at Whitesburg, just on the Kentucky side of the Gap, to guard against any Union movement toward Virginia. It was at this point that a 24-year-old school teacher from Mount Sterling, Kentucky, who had secured a staff officer position as secretary to Humphrey Marshall, had just arrived and begun his daily journal on his time in the Confederate Army. On February 5th, he had his first encounter with the 5th Kentucky Infantry at Whitesburg, on his way to Marshall's headquarters in Virginia. Garrett wrote that they were, quote, a large, fine-looking, ill-clad regiment, unquote. But he was less impressed with Jack May, saying, quote, the famous Jack May of Ivy Mountain and West Liberty notoriety is here also. I am rather disappointed in him, unquote. The constant marching, bad weather, insufficient clothing, scarce food, and the stress of war had taken their toll on Marshall's army camped on both sides of Pound Gap, and those guarding the gap itself. Predictably, disease began to ravage the troops, and 175 men of the 5th at Whitesburg were already sick, along with hundreds more in Virginia. Contaminated food and water by men occupying close quarters inevitably caused a whole rogues gallery of diseases to rear their ugly heads. Although the exact diseases in Marshall's camp are unknown, the number one killer in the Civil War was dysentery that caused vomiting and bloody diarrhea. Typhoid or camp fever, pneumonia, measles, mumps, smallpox, ague or swamp fever, yellow fever, malaria, relapse fever, and tuberculosis all felled their share of men on both sides of the war. In addition to disease and hunger, the prospect of leaving the state again caused large-scale desertion among the men of the 5th. George Noble wrote 50 years later, quote, the soldiers had heard that the army was ordered to Virginia, and they began to desert in great squads, taking their guns and ammunition. About 200 left, unquote. Perhaps news that Fort Henry on the Tennessee River had fallen to Union forces lowered their morale as well. Some of the 5th, commanded by Colonel Williams, including May's Company A, remained on the Kentucky side of Pound Gap, while others, including George Noble, crossed over to forage for the ever-scarce food along the Pound River. On February 9, one of Garfield's Union regiments that had been camped near Middle Creek since the battle a month earlier moved south to occupy Pikeville or Piketon, and were now only 20 miles from Pound Gap. Marshall ordered a company of Virginia mounted rifles to patrol south of Piketon and placed all of his Kentuckians on alert. On about the 19th of February, news arrived of the surrender of 14,000 Confederates to Ulysses S. Grant at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River after a 4-day siege. The next day, on the same day that President and Mrs. Lincoln's 12-year-old son Willie died of typhoid fever, Jack May led his Company A with the Barkers and Gevedons north on a patrol and attacked an irregular band of Unionists camped on the head of Mud Creek. It was perilously close to the Union regiments camped at Pikeville and a dangerous move. On the 23rd of February, Nashville became the first Confederate state capital to fall to the Union. About the same time, the rains came to southeast Kentucky and especially around Pikeville, where the Union Army was camped. Noble on the Virginia side of Pound Gap wrote, quote, the tide came in and washed off the bridge over the Pound River, and wagons could not pass, and we had to live on half rations for a week, unquote. May had to suspend his forays near Pikeville and rejoin the rest of the 5th at Whitesburg, and together they finally re-entered Virginia through the Pound Gap, guarded by an impressive breastworks manned by Virginia militiamen. On that same day, Edward Garrett, who was now at Marshall's headquarters in Gladeville, was appalled by what he saw, writing, quote, death is nothing here, where so many die and all are liable to at any moment. No one can imagine the wretchedness and misery to which the poor sick soldier is often exposed in transportation and in many hospitals. It seems to me that I would rather die in a decent, comfortable house than to live in one of those miserable abodes of the sick. I have seen the sick, the dying, and the dead all stretched upon their scanty straw pallets in the same room. To die in such a place with no family face to look upon them, no friendly ear to whisper a last request, no loving hand to close our dying eyes and stretch us for a grave." Unquote. 2 days later, the 5th Kentucky entered Gladeville, where they drew pork, flour, coffee, and rice. But according to Noble, it was hard for the Kentuckians to leave behind cornbread and freestone water for wheat bread and limestone water. After camping for a couple of weeks just south of Gladeville, Marshall moved his headquarters and Virginians to Lebanon. The 5th Kentucky moved farther south to camp on Big Moccasin Creek so as not to overtax any one location for forage. Those soldiers too sick to march were left behind. One of them was one of Hezekiah Barker's descendants, William from Company D. He succumbed to an unknown disease on March 16th. The 5th Kentucky was now down 3 Barkers. In addition to this Elliott County William, Hezekiah's grandson Lewis had been captured at Middle Creek and at some point switched sides, joining the 42nd Ohio Infantry. The first loss was John Barker's son, William of Morgan County, Kentucky, killed and left on Ivy Mountain in November. As best as can be calculated, of the 12 sworn into the 5th, there were now 9 Barkers still meeting muster at the Big Moccasin Creek camp, and all 3 Gevedons, brothers-in-law of the Morgan County Barkers. Conditions at the Big Moccasin camp were no better than the ones they left at Gladeville. Scarce food, miserable weather, with perpetually wet ground, tents, and equipment continued to winnow the ranks of the 5th Kentucky. On March 16th, about 700 of James Garfield's army that had taken part in the Battle of Middle Creek launched a surprise attack on the Virginia State militiamen guarding Pound Gap, commanded by Major J.B. Thompson, and they fled with barely more than the clothes on their backs. Thompson said, quote, "I got out with all my men. I fought them for nearly an hour and a half until my retreat was nearly cut off," unquote. The New York Times led with the headline, "Rebels Whipped at Pound Gap, Gallant Dash by General Garfield." While the number of rebels was greatly exaggerated once again, it is true that Garfield did find and burn their camp with 60 log huts, a barracks, a commissary, and recovered a large quantity of stores. At headquarters in Lebanon, Marshall called out the militias of 10 counties, but a week later remarked in a letter that his call-up had unfortunately produced a strong movement of men to the Union. The 5th Kentucky was still hunkered down at Big Moccasin Creek awaiting Marshall's orders. The weather had turned from constant rain to constant snow. From Lebanon, Garrett wrote, quote, "Snow, snow, 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 snowed all day incessantly. Dreary, melancholy day, day of evil. How often do I ask myself, do they miss me at home? Do they miss me? And how it wrings my heart to think I may not be missed," unquote. Meanwhile, 150 miles west of the Big Moccasin camp, Josie Underwood writes in her diary from Bowling Green, Kentucky, "Though slave owners, Josie's parents are staunch Union preservationists, while many of their family and friends are secesh, causing great strains on relationships. Bowling Green on the pike connecting Louisville with the recently captured Nashville is once more in Union hands." Josie writes, quote, "The Philistines are upon us. All the troops going south pass by our door, cavalry, infantry, artillery. The tramp of men and horses, the jingling of trappings, the rattling of artillery, passing day after day and often night after night, has become the pervading sound of our days. Frequently the regimental bands playing as they march along, always some gay inspiring tune to which the soldiers keep step with a buoyant happy air, as though they were on some holiday parade instead of going to battle and death," unquote. 3 days later, Josie's entry reads, quote, "Poor Confeds, my heart goes out to them in pity. Though all wrong from my standpoint, there is something grand and heroic in the reckless daring that could ever induce them to put themselves against this strong government, with its inexhaustible supply of men and money, and they don't seem for a minute to realize the self-sacrifice they are making and absolutely confident of winning out, even when they are hungry and cold. Better for them to be at war in the South, where half the soldiers have no overcoats," unquote. Sensing unrest and fearing large-scale desertion, Colonel Williams moved his 5th Kentucky Regiment farther south to Holston Springs on the border with Tennessee. On the last day of March 1862, several angry and fed-up men of the 5th had to be separated from the rest. If the weather didn't break soon, the regiment was headed towards mutiny. Could it get any worse? Look for part 7 in this series.